recording here so I don't forget. Welcome to our monthly discussion, big ideas, real talk, big ideas. This month's topic is philanthropy. So we're really glad that you're here with us. I'm going to send a copy of this, the link to the recording after this recording in case people who registered are not able to attend. Just in terms of housekeeping, your mics are muted right now, but you're welcome to turn on your camera if you'd like so we can see you. Although we'll keep ours on just so we're not talking to all the black boxes. If you can't, that's okay too. And we will unmute mics when we get into more of a discussion. So I'm Dr. Alicia Shadaman, the director of our Center for Nonprofit and NGO Studies here at NIU. I'm an associate professor. I've been here at NIU since 2010 and worked in the public and nonprofit sectors before completing my PhD at Rutgers. And I was an executive director for 4 years. So I feel a little bit of that pain that many of you might be experiencing. I'm joined today by two experts, a community expert and a research expert in this area of philanthropy to give their kind of thoughts, opinions, experiences around this topic of philanthropy. So Dr. Laurie Paarlberg, she is the Charles Stewart Mott Chair on Community Foundations at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University and is affiliate faculty in the School of Public and Environmental Affairs. Her research focuses on the changing nature of community philanthropy with a particular focus on strategic shifts in grant making by local United Ways and community foundations. Our other community expert, Brett Weiss, received his bachelor's degree from NIU, so he's a Husky, in political science and economics, and then a master's degree in education from Governor State University. He had a number of experiences during his career, and Brett and I were just chatting about that, including teaching, research, sales, and then public service in government. And after a trip to Kenya in 2009, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that, he felt compelled to focus on education in that part of the world. And so the Weiss Scholarship Foundation was born, and he's been directing that organization after retiring from teaching high school social studies. So thank you both for being here. I'm going to let them kind of chime in and give them some, start with their kind of overall comments. And then each of them will take in turn, 10 or 15 minutes to kind of share their experiences and ideas around this broad topic of philanthropy. And then we'll get into a broader discussion that I'll facilitate. So Laurie, if you'd like to go first.
Excellent, Alicia. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm sorry that I can't be in there in person. And as you stated in my introduction, and thank you for that introduction, I'm a faculty member at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, where my research is really at the intersection of community and philanthropy. What I'm going to talk now is give a big picture of some of the research that we've been doing, what I think is happening in the field, and then focus on what's going on with COVID-19. So I study community philanthropic organizations and think about those as those public charities that raise money from the community and then distribute it to community. And I define community in a very narrow geographic sense. So community is place, and it aligns with the Council on Foundations definition of what a community foundation is. So for me, there's a lot of actors in that space, but I focus my research on community foundations and United Ways. And the basic reason is that they're two of the historic traditions in the US. They increasingly play really important roles in public policy. And they've got this huge footprint in this space. So for the past 2 years, ever since I arrived at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, we've been trying to get a landscape picture of what does this space look like? And what does grant making look like? How has it been changing? What are the roles as espoused by community foundations and United Ways? How does that align with their grant making? And then ultimately, how do United Ways and community foundations navigate relationships? Because they're what we would call friend enemies sometimes. They collaborate, but yet there's this competition perhaps for resources, donors, and even in policy spaces sometimes. So we were engaged in this really large landscape project. And the reason for the landscape project was that the field is changing. A lot of shifts in the economy as well as social changes are really leading people to question, why should I have an intermediary, and why an intermediary that focuses on place? So our research was taking place in the context of these questions. And then lo and behold, we were actually out in the field doing interviews. I almost got stuck in California when COVID hit. And so immediately we said, well, gosh, we've got to understand what's going on around COVID and community philanthropic organizations. So we launched this really huge COVID study. And if anyone's interested, I'll give you the link to our website because we've been mapping United Ways and community foundations in this space. The first thing is I don't study disasters. So the first thing that I learned about this is disaster response by policy and action is largely local. And that fit right in with my research, which was local based. So we started tracking on March 20th the rise of funds and then money in and out from these funds that were launched by community philanthropic organizations. It's really pretty incredible. Let me just give you one example. So in Indianapolis on March 13th, the United Way of Central Indiana announced the launch of a COVID-19 fund in partnership with about 6 other philanthropic organizations in Central Indiana. On March 24th, they had announced that they had raised $22 million. Now, in case you didn't get those numbers, that's 11 days later. They had $22 million in the fund. Now we're making their first round of grants. I mean, talk about quick in and quick out. Pretty incredible. So it really spurred our motivation to look further. So we've been tracking each month. By the end of August, we had identified 1,020 funds. That's still approximate. The data cleaning is endless. $1.25 billion had been raised and almost $1 billion distributed. So pretty incredible about the amounts of money coming in and out. And that's in addition to the regular convening and facilitating roles and information dissemination that these organizations usually play. This is just sheer fundraising in and out. So this was really fascinating to us, but as we know, philanthropic resources or capacity are not evenly distributed across place. So we've been looking at, well, where are these funds rising and how is place related to the scale of these efforts? We're in preliminary analysis of this. I just presented our findings last week, but one of the first things that we know is that it's the larger the Community Foundation United Way, the more likely that they're going to have a fund. Pretty self-evident. You need capacity to launch a fund. Communities that have higher socioeconomic status are more likely to have a fund. Makes a lot of sense. And then we began to look at things. Okay, so what about the money in, the size of funds? What's related to that? And we found some really kind of interesting things, which are suggesting that these funds have a lot of signaling going on from the political environment. So funds that are located in states that have restrictions around COVID-19 are doing better at fundraising. So the signaling that this is really serious, and this is controlling for the number of cases. So this isn't based on need. We've already controlled for that. But yet the percent voting Republican is negatively associated with fundraising. So it appears that community foundations and United Ways are really operating right now in a really highly political environment when they're both starting a fund and then fundraising in this environment, which in some ways is pretty new for them because usually they're thought of as operating in neutral policy environments. So just to conclude, our research has opened more questions than we've answered. So for instance, what's going to be the outcomes in communities? Does the fundraising efforts and some of the facilitation and capacity building efforts going on improve community robustness and well-being, particularly in response to the next disaster? And how are we going to measure that? Or not even next disaster, let's just think about sustainability long term. We also think that we have a productive cycle, a winners take all cycle. So high socioeconomic communities are able to launch funds, which may be associated with their robustness, improving their own capacity. And so is this one in which high socioeconomic communities are going to fare better because of their ability to launch a fund? And then more also connected with that is the idea of, so who benefits? What is the collective action? Is it for communal benefit? Is everyone broadly benefiting? Because we know that the costs of the pandemic have been really heavily concentrated in many of our socioeconomically disadvantaged communities. And then the final question that we've raised is we've had some really great opportunities to take part in meetings, particularly in Indiana with local leaders. And what we're hearing are these really great quotes. We're leading from the back. We're trying to collaborate when we're trying to figure out how to keep our own organization open. This has a way of exposing civic and philanthropic leadership that it's no longer an agenda item. We have to be doing it right now. In rural communities, we're hearing things like, we have no mayor, we have no United Way. It's just us. What do we do? So it's raising large questions for us. Is this a pivotal moment where we're going to see these community-based organizations taking on even new and different roles? So thank you. And I look forward to my colleagues' presentation and questions later.
Awesome. Thank you, Laurie. All right, Brett, we're going to go from local community. Tell us how you got into this philanthropic space and why you're working where you're working.
I will do that. First, it's especially exciting to be part of an NIU class, very special in my heart. I spent 3 years as an RA at Lincoln Hall many, many years ago and have fond memories of that. Um, I guess, Alicia, it was very kind in referring to me as an expert. I don't think I would use that term defining me in regard to the session here. If someone had told me 12 years ago that I was going to start a nonprofit, run it, and try to make it grow, I would have told them they were crazy. There's nothing in my academic background or work background that would have said I'm going to be doing this. And it all started in the magical trip in 2009, a volunteer trip to a little village called Dago in southwestern Kenya. Fell in love with the people who are as poor as any people on earth, and just knew I had to do something to help them. So what happened is in 2011, I was getting ready to go back, and I had this crazy idea of like, why don't we start a nonprofit and try to send some kids to high school? Because in Kenya, virtually no child goes to high school because the parents can't afford to pay for it. And in 2012, we awarded our first scholarship, a young man named Victor, who's actually in his last year at university now. And we now have awarded 79 scholarships. Basically, we send kids to high school, and then from there, they go on either to university or vocational school, and we help them do that. When I started this, in terms of this class here, I had no idea what I was doing, absolutely none. Now, I have a background. I spent about half of my life as a high school social studies teacher, mostly economics is what I taught. And I also spent about half of my life selling software and managing software salespeople. So there certainly are skills that I learned and used from those professions that helped me here. I mean, especially in selling. I spend most of my life fundraising. And while fundraising is not exactly the same as selling software, the skill set's pretty similar. You know, I have my pipeline list of who I'm trying to get donations from. So anyway, so I've been doing this, and, you know, I created a board of directors. I have an advisory board. I'm always trying to reach out to more people to help. And what we feel we have done is we've built a business model. I kind of approach it more as a businessman. I really don't even think of myself as a nonprofit person. As we grew, we hired 2 full-time employees in Kenya. They're both university graduates trained to be teachers. They are our mentor coordinators. They run our programs day to day. They're very, very engaged in the lives of all of our children. These children come from homes where very few of them have both parents alive. AIDS has devastated that world. Many don't have either parent alive. So they, in a sense, kind of become their parents because the challenges they face every day are far beyond anything any children would have to face here. So I've learned along the way, as I've kiddingly said, I think a couple times since I got on with Alicia, I think I've done some things well, and I think I've done a whole lot of things not very well. I can look back at some things I had ideas on, like, wow, this would be a really cool idea, and it really bombed. But, you know, you got to try different things there. We have a few years ago, we made the decision because, you know, I'm not a kid and I'm not going to be around forever. We were trying to decide, are we just going to phase this out or we're going to try to go big? And it was like, what the heck? Let's go big. If you're going to do this, you might as well. So we are trying to make this an enduring foundation. In other words, one that will last beyond my lifetime. I do this as a volunteer. I don't get paid at all. And to be frank, I put a lot of my own money in. So I eventually need to get to the point where I can hire somebody to run this day to day and pay them a fair salary and probably even a second person. That's a big hill for us to climb. But in order to make it enduring, we need to get there. And the reason we want to make it enduring is, sadly, there's pretty much an unlimited supply of very poor children in the world. More than half the children in the world get little to no education. So the challenge is big, and we felt we have built a good business model. And while we have much more we want to do in this particular village, we want to take this model and go to village number 2 and village number 3. Just within 50, 60 miles of this village, there's all kinds of little villages like this that have no scholarship fund at all. There is nothing happening for these children. They're generally quitting school at 4th grade. The girls get married off, and the cycle of poverty just continues. So I'll touch on COVID a little bit. COVID clearly has been devastating in both ends of what we do. For the children, they've been home since mid-March. People ask me how the e-learning is going for the kids in Kenya. Well, when you don't have electricity, you really can't do e-learning. There is no e-learning. We have one building now that has electricity there. And so I've taken some of our money and we've invested in some technology with a few computers, a router, a couple printers, and our 2 mentor coordinators who are trained to be teachers. We are running classes, and everybody's wearing masks. There's another project I run that we started a tailoring school. And so when COVID started, we had all the students there make up masks. They mask and they social distance. We're trying to do everything we can to keep things going. The other key thing we're trying to do is school is a relatively safe place for these children, especially girls. Not being in school means they're a whole lot less safe. The world's a lot more dangerous, especially for girls. So every day I'm having our people check in with these girls, all the kids really, but especially the girls, and making sure that they're safe. COVID obviously has affected our donations. It's affecting individual donations dramatically. Also, and when we decided to go big a couple of years ago, I started reaching out to foundations because I'm looking for people who can write what I call the big check. Earlier this year, we had our first success with a $20,000 grant from the $1 Million Roundtable Foundation based in Park Ridge. But COVID has just ended all that because, I mean, Laurie probably knows far better than I do that all the foundations, pretty much all of their resources are going towards COVID. And I'm not complaining about that. We're in a worldwide pandemic. It has to. I understand that. But it's really hurt us. It's really set us back on that. That's kind of really my story. And I'll just end there, and I look forward to questions.
I thought to start, we could think about or comment, if each of you could comment on what motivates someone to give locally versus globally. And so, Laurie, if you have seen that kind of research, because you're talking almost about 2 ends of the philanthropic spectrum. So I'm curious what you think. Are they the same donors or are they different donors?
So I think that part of it is also generational.
Okay.
Right. So I think we have to lay that on the table for a lot of our older traditional donors who particularly would have been donors to the United Way, community foundations, particularly more affluent. Much local giving is place-based. It's a sense of identity of their hometown, of their community. However, for younger donors, many see their communities in multiple places, right? So they see themselves as part of a global community and as part of a local community. And so those donors are probably splitting their giving between both. The challenge that we get is for people who are transitory, who have even less connection to a local place where they may be giving and are thinking about themselves as part of a broader community of interest and part of a global community.
And Brett, do you have experience in that when it comes to your donors? What does that donor profile look like that is interested in giving globally?
Yeah, no, it's actually a great question. And it's one that I spend a lot of time thinking about, because I would say that most people who donate to us are very good at donating locally also. But there's only a small segment of the people who donate locally who are going to tend to donate globally. And I've had to learn that. I've never had a marketing class in my life. And I've been asked a lot over the years, what is your target audience? And my silly answer was always, well, anybody with money. And of course, that's a lousy answer. But what I've learned, and this is directly to your question, Alicia, globally, I've learned that people who have been to a third world country, and by when I say go to a third world country, if you go to Kenya and you go on safari and that's all you do, you haven't been to Kenya. Okay, I mean really going to a village and seeing what life is like for people who live this way. People who have done that are much more likely to give. The other thing I would say, and I've tried to do some reading about this, I've read a number of books on this stuff, and I think Laurie kind of touched on this. Millennials are, as a group, are much more likely to give to a cause like ours, I think, than people of other generations. I think millennials tend to think much more globally. Um, uh, the other other thing I would say is I have a number of steady donors who are people who grew up in third world countries, whether it be in Asia or Africa, because once again they get it, so they tend to donate. So I'm always looking for those kind of people who really think globally.
And kind of along the same lines of demographic characteristics, is there a gender component to this at all in your research? Have you seen that, Laurie, of the people who give? So we talk about generational age-wise. Is there a gender thing here? Laurie and Brett, I'm curious about what you think.
I'm very curious what Laurie's going to say. I'm going to learn from her here.
Oh, Brett, I was going to let you go first and talk about your donors.
No. Well, okay. Well, then I'll learn from you later. But I was going to say, we definitely get more donations from women. Definitely, there's no doubt. And if I did the numbers, it's probably 70% or so of our donors are women. And that doesn't mean their husbands or somebody else in their life isn't a part of it. But definitely, women tend to be much more likely to give to a cause like ours. Laurie, go ahead.
Well, mine is not as relative to Brett's work, but let's think about place-based giving. And for the United Ways, that was largely rooted in workplace campaigns. And so, unfortunately, and we're talking oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes about higher level executives, higher upper managers, and a lot of that giving traditionally, historically, was male dominated.
Okay.
For the United Way, it was out of an obligation through a workplace campaign. So the United Way worldwide is trying to move out of that and to move to the modern United Way and make a more inclusive donor base, move away from workplace giving as the only way that people give, and trying to change that to broaden their donor base. Community foundations is a slightly different take on that, because community foundations, oftentimes you're looking for larger gifts, they're building endowments, and most often those are family decisions. But one of the interesting things is that I'm hearing from community foundations that they're increasingly seeing women being active in this space. But I think often it was through family legacy giving.
So Laurie, you mentioned it, and Brett, you touched on it. What about endowment giving? We know in this time that might be a way that some of these organizations will actually survive. If they have an endowment, that's likely going to carry them. But what about endowment giving in terms of setting it up, or, people who give to endowments, are they different too? So I don't know if either of you want to comment on just that endowment piece, because I've seen, if you have investment income, you're probably going to make out a little bit better than your typical nonprofit right now.
Right. Exactly. So when we think about the difference between United Ways and community foundations, one of the ways they're different is that United Ways are based in an annual giving campaign. Some of them are trying to get endowments set up for those difficult years. Community foundations are based in legacy giving. They're based in a foundation model, an endowed model, like a private foundation. But the interesting thing is, if we put that into all the larger nonprofit community, one of the controversies is, should organizations be building endowments? Should they be taking money out of current needs and putting them aside to long-term giving? So that's something that the field is debating, and I think we're hearing it now. We're seeing a push for private foundations to move the money out of their endowments quicker. So I think it's a big topic for discussion. It's really an interesting topic. Who gives to endowments is generally people who want to leave a legacy gift. They want to be able to somehow have their money go far into the future. They're looking for some kind of long-term impact.
So I want to come back to kind of the drawdown idea, but Brett, do you want to comment on endowments? Is that part of your business strategy? You mentioned
it. A few months ago, I would have said no, not at all. But it has become that. Once again, our goal is to become an enduring foundation. So me and my board, at the beginning of this year, started talking about an endowment. And we actually, literally last week was we had a board meeting last week, and we have an investment proposal, and my board passed that. And in January, we are going to make our first investment to begin an endowment. It will be small, but everything big starts small. But it's been a journey for me to be on that I've kind of had to change my philosophy. I was very proud for a number of years. I could say every penny donated goes right to the kids. There's nothing else. Well, then when we got bigger and I really needed to hire people, that changed that story a little bit. Then when we bought some technology for them, that changed that story a little bit. And I kind of had to realize, okay, if we're going to grow, become a real nonprofit, we have to do that. So earlier this year, I was kind of against starting an endowment, because even before COVID, I was. But I know that if we're going to become this enduring foundation and be around for many years, long past my time here on Earth, we have to start building an endowment. So we are going to take our first step in January on that.
So I'm curious, as both of you mentioned this idea of donors, and how do you remain accountable to donors? So for you, Brett, that's a continent away. They're not going to maybe see the work that you're doing. But even for local community foundations, people who donate, they might not be recipients or know someone that's been a recipient of that philanthropy. So when you think about philanthropy, how do you think about accountability for philanthropic gifts? Brett, do you want to chime in first?
Well, I'll say for myself, I have worked very hard to keep our donors in touch with our students and to know what the students are doing through pictures, through letters. We get all their report cards, through videos, things. I have lots of videos of when we're there and talking to the kids. So I probably almost do too much in terms of keeping people aware. We also, about half of our kids are sponsored by one person or one family, and we keep a special relationship with them, because I really want to make sure that they can see over and over and over every year the great things that are happening because of their donation. And a kind of side note, the Zoom world has created a pretty cool thing here. Zoom works very well in this little village. WhatsApp kind of worked, kind of didn't work. And because the kids are back home in Dago, in the last month, we've done a few Zoom calls with our people in Kenya, the child that they're sponsoring, and then the person here in the United States, or couple who is sponsoring them. And it has been wonderful, and it works really, really well. So I do try to keep our donors very engaged with what's going on to make them feel good about their donation.
So Laurie, your thoughts on accountability for philanthropic gifts to these community-based organizations?
Yeah, that's a really great question. The United Way, more than 2 decades ago, really led the nonprofit field on this issue. And now it seems sort of dated, but they led the movement to a logic model, right? How do we think about what outcomes do we want in the community and what steps do we need to take how to get it? They really made it pretty simple and rational. And they used that to try to push that out to the organizations that they were funding. And that corresponded with, I think, a large shift in the field from moving away from the idea that we're going to fund an organization because of what they want to do, to how do we fund organizations to make a difference in the community, to have impact. And we see both the United Ways and the community foundations moving in that direction. It's slow and it's hard, right? I mean, how do we evaluate the impact of a scholarship that a child may receive when, that's 20 years down the road to see that impact? So those are just difficult questions, but the field is moving to this notion of evaluating impact of their work.
And something else that you brought up, and then I'll open it up for questions as well from the audience. But one other question: when you think about the government regulation of philanthropy in the United States, it's unlike any other country in the world when it comes to the tax structure and government regulations. So foundations have to give away minimum percent from their endowments, and their nonprofits themselves are heavily regulated, have to register, all of that kind of thing. Any thoughts or comments on that regulation? Is that good for philanthropy, or is it not, because it is so heavily regulated? Laurie, I don't know if you want to go first on this one.
Yeah, I'll go first on that. I mean, I think that in the US, some minimal regulation sort of inspires some confidence that you sort of have an idea of how your gift is being used. I think that's good to inspire confidence. I think in general, nonprofits want to be self-regulated, right? They want to identify their own accountability standards and hold themselves to that. I think one of the challenges for United Ways and community foundations is they're in this weird space that they're not private foundations, so they're not bound to rules of private foundations and minimum payouts, particularly difficult for community foundations, which are sitting on huge assets and have no minimum payout requirements. But I think probably the biggest space we're going to see the next round of regulation is around donor advised funds. And that's a whole other issue. It affects community foundations right now. It's probably going to affect United Ways in the future as United Ways move into establishing donor advised funds.
So Brett,
Yeah.
your understanding of how does the nonprofit sector work in Kenya, or how is it organized, and how does that compare to the United States?
Well, it really, I mean, in Kenya, we eventually want to become an NGO in Kenya. And I've looked into that, and it's everything in Kenya is very complicated. Everything in Kenya, you have to pay bribes to get it done. Eventually, we want to do that. On this general topic here that we're talking about, it's not something I know much about, although I will add, part of my journey here is 2 years ago, I had someone tell me they were going to send me a check from their donor advised fund. And I looked at them and I went, what's a donor advised fund? I didn't even know what it is. Now I've learned a lot about that. We get more checks. I did sit in a webinar a few weeks ago where a couple from California who are pushing to get, there's so much money sitting in donor advised funds, and they're really pushing for more of that money to get out and not just sit in the bank accounts.
Right. Awesome. Well, if others want to chime in, because I can keep having great conversations with you guys, because it's a fascinating topic to me. I love that we teach it in our undergraduate program, philanthropy and fundraising, both the why do we give and donor motivations, as well as how to do it. I think it's a great course that we have in our program. But if other people have some, I'm just going to bring up participants. So if you want to chime in or ask a question, you can put it in the chat, or you can pop your hand up. You can put a reaction out, and then I can see that to make sure that I don't miss it. Well, maybe while people are thinking about a question, can you tell me like your own personal view of philanthropy, how you got into this space yourself? So I know, Brett, you kind of gave us a little bit about your background, but in terms of giving, was this kind of giving, were you giving globally before this, or did this trip kind of spur that whole thing? Or were you always kind of globally minded, or were you giving locally, kind of to Laurie's point, were you giving on a community level?
Yeah, most of my giving was local. To be frank, part of why I took the trip is I did give some global money, but I always was in fear. We know there are so many charities around the world trying to help poor kids in Africa, and you donate some money, and 6 months later you find out that guy is buying a new Mercedes and a yacht with that money. And so part of why I started this is because I knew that I could control it. Every penny was going right to the kids. So anyway, Laurie, why don't you take it from there? I have some other thoughts on it, but you take it.
Sure. So I have a little longer story. So I actually was a nonprofit manager and realized I had no clue what I was doing. Happened to live in Bloomington, Indiana. I had no idea that, that was a really great school to study nonprofit management. So I just applied, got in, said, I'm just going to stay and get this PhD. Long story short, 6 years later, I get a PhD in public affairs and I take my first job in San Francisco. So now imagine I moved my 17-year-old daughter, senior in high school, from suburban Bloomington, Indiana, to an urban inner city San Francisco high school, public school, which is where she insisted she was going. And she was one of 10 white students in her school. Everyone was on free and reduced lunch. So she had this transformative experience. She went out to wrestle. She was a wrestler, and they had no money to finance athletics at school. And so there were teams, but they were sort of like the coaches doing it out of their own free goodwill. So we had this 21-year-old kid with this team of 10 wrestlers. So my husband and I wrote a check for my daughter to wrestle. Now I was a public administration scholar, and all of it said, wow, philanthropy, funding public activities at school? This is kind of odd. Why does this happen? And what's the implications for equity in our communities? And that launched me down the path of taking my public administration hat to look at the issue of place-based philanthropy and where it arises and under what circumstances and how that relates to our notion of governance. So
and I think that's
one of the
story. That's one of the ways we probably cross, is I'm totally interested in the extent to which philanthropy is funding public services more and more. So in Kenya, Brett, that's why your organization exists, because there is no public funding for education.
Right, for high school, there's not. So I'm going to give you kind of my definition and thinking about this today of philanthropy. And I have no idea if this is just something that's going to sound totally crazy and weird and only in my mind, or something somebody else thinks about. My view of philanthropy is needed to make up for the failures of government and the private sector.
Yep.
You know,
That's a theory. There is a whole body of research that supports you.
really, okay,
Yep.
it's
Government
just something
failure
I thought
theory.
about.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, so that's interesting. Okay, because
And all
to
students should
me,
know that.
Yeah.
okay, to me, if government and the private sector were doing their job, we wouldn't need philanthropy.
Yeah.
So that's kind of
Yeah.
okay. So I guess I'm not as crazy as I thought.
No.
All right.
And it's definitely one aspect of it. Government failure theory is explains some of it. So especially around education and basic human services and public services, it doesn't explain it all, because there's a lot of philanthropy that doesn't go to kind of those basic needs. So I don't know, Laura, if you want to comment on those other explanations for philanthropy outside of government failure.
Well, so Brett, one of the notions also is that philanthropy is the preferred American way of doing something. It reflects our American values, our idealism, our collective nature, our fear of large government. So that's, the sort of other non-governmental failure, but, this is inherent in the American makeup. But there's also another piece, is that it's a way for individuals to express their private expressive values, be that whatever their moral or religious values may be. So we also have to emphasize that as well.
Yeah. But yeah, you're absolutely right. So the poli-sci person in you, Brett, I'll send you some readings. You can read about government failure.
Good, yes,
but in
yes.
your space, it explains that perfectly. And we're seeing that more and more in the United States. So it used to be around quality of life issues, around like public parks. We're going to make public parks better by adding some benches, but we can't afford to buy benches. So the friends of the parks are going to put in benches. But not that in the United States, it's expanding beyond that kind of the nice quality of life stuff into basic need, especially in this area of education.
Right. I mean, a place like Kenya, the government failure is so enormous. When I first got there and learned that most kids quit school by 4th grade, I'm thinking like, well, why would you quit school? How are you ever going to have a better life if you quit? Well, then the answer was because the government doesn't pay for high school at all. So about 4th grade, they realized they're never going to go to high school. So why bother to go to school at all? Because what happens when they quit, they try to get a job working in the fields where they can make $1 a day for any day they can work. And in that world, you bring home $1, it's big money.
Right.
So it was like the government doesn't pay for high school. I mean, I never knew that. Yeah.
Well, you touch on another thing here in terms of how far your dollars can go outside of the United States. So if I had $500 and I'm going to give it to a very wealthy suburban district to buy volleyballs for their gym that's already very equipped, or take my $500 and go spend it in Kenya or a third world country, there is something in there where donors can see, my guess is, just how far your dollars can go.
So Alicia, I owe you for this one, because that's a perfect question. Because one of my favorite things is we send kids to high school for 4 years. Now, these are boarding schools, room and board, books, fees, tuition, everything. And they're there almost all year for $3,500. That's all 4 years. I mean, think about that. 3,000, I put 2 kids through college. Think of what we pay for that. $3,500 of US money totally changes a child's life in Kenya.
Yeah. I don't know, Laurie, if you have thoughts on that in terms of donors, where their priorities are when you think about global versus local.
Actually, I've heard that argument before. I actually had a friend who started another organization building schools, and I think it was in Kenya. And that was her argument: for $10,000, I could build a school, right? I can't touch a problem here in the US for that.
Right.
Or the complexity, right? We just can't. I mean, in Kenya, you probably had the ability to just go out and hire a contractor and build a school. I was involved with an organization building schools in India.
Yeah, nothing is easy in Kenya. First of all, you have to start paying bribes to get anything done. Everything's very complicated there. But I'll tell you a quick side story that Alicia ties into this here. About probably 8-9 months ago, I had a gentleman who happens to live in Chicago do $50 donation. It was going to be a monthly recurring donation. And we had some wonderful chats. And then a couple of weeks later, he calls me up and he's kind of down and he feels terrible. And he says, you know what? He said, I stopped my recurring donation, keep the $50, but I really decided I just wanted to help kids in Chicago. And I said to him, I said, that's fine. That's great. To me, just help a child somewhere. 20% of the kids in the United States are growing up poor right now. That's a crime. So,
Yeah.
I always say just help a child somewhere.
No, I think that's a great mantra. So what do you say about those? And I guess you already touched on that. The needs within the United States, how are they changing or growing when it comes to community philanthropy, Laurie? Are the United Ways and community foundations changing what they do based on needs here in the United States?
Oh gosh. I mean,
I
that's a
know.
really deep, hard question because I
Yeah.
think that we have all been sobered by the huge needs that the pandemic and the
Yeah.
huge gaps that the pandemic has been exposed. And I think community foundation leaders, particularly those that just don't see themselves as a vessel for money, right? Vessel for money, we're going to hold it and we're going to put it out, are really trying to figure out where can they enter the system and how can they make the biggest impact. And I think that's weighing heavily on a lot of leaders is, how they are going to be stewards of resources and be a conduit effectively to get resources in and out to the greatest needs, um, and play a leadership role in doing it. So I think that's a sobering question now that nobody has the answer to.
I talked a little bit before about girls and getting an education. And, it's always been a much tougher world for girls, especially in third world countries, than boys. And I think there's some progress that's been made in recent years. And COVID has just probably destroyed most of the progress. Um, so I'll say this here. It's not something I say generally in public for class. When I talk about girls not being safe in Kenya, and this is true in a lot of third world countries now, as a result of schools being closed, rates of young girls are way up and teenage pregnancies are way up. And there's a big fear that many of the girls who were in high school are not going to return. By the way, in Kenya, if a girl's pregnant, you can't go to high school. There is no high school if you're pregnant. So I think COVID dramatically hurts people more in third world countries, and girls and women are hurt even more than that. And to some extent, we're going to have to start all over with a lot of that.
And Alicia, following back up on that, you gave the example earlier where a lot of organizations maybe, we're building park benches or gazebos in the center of the park and beautification. And I do not want to downplay that placemaking because that's really important. But we increasingly see, particularly in rural places where there isn't much infrastructure, United Ways and community foundations really digging into basic issues of economic development and inclusive economic development. So it's really shifting to get to some of those really root causes. We've got a community foundation here in rural Indiana that is taking on childhood poverty.
Wow.
Right, and trying to get to the root causes of that. And that's a huge shift from what they would have been doing in the past.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to before we close for the hour, I don't want to miss kind of talking about the impact of governance in philanthropy and how nonprofit boards, philanthropic boards, and foundation boards are trying to address diversity and social justice inside the organization, apart from what they're funding, but also just internally. Any thoughts or comments on that? Have you seen that be more of a shift over COVID and of these last few months as we've gone through Black Lives Matter?
There's been a gradual groundswell, but even prior to COVID, even prior to the social justice movement, in the early spring or late spring, early summer. So there's been a movement within the field, a lot of workshops, blogs, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's reached a groundswell because organizations realize we can't influence our community and be more inclusive and promote social justice if we ourselves as organizations aren't practicing it. So there's questions about how do we diversify our boards effectively, not just putting people on as token members, but actually how do we include them in decision making? What do those governance practices look like? And also, how do we bring community voices into the organization? Oftentimes, we're talking about organizations that were pretty isolated from the community. And so how do we increase community safe? So I think it's a huge topic, and how we do it is another issue.
Right. Brett, is that something that you have thought about internally to your organization? Who's on your board? What's that composition look like, and where do those funds get directed?
Yeah, I mean, only to a small extent, really. When we first had our board, there was 5 of us, and we all were white, and we only had 1 female. And of course, and we really talked about, well, that has to change. And this is why we were so lucky and blessed to find Susan Kagamwa, who her and her husband, once again, are from a village near this village in Kenya. So Susan's a female, and she isn't just Black, she's African. She was born in Africa. And her perspective on the board, she says things in board meetings, even for me, and I've been to Kenya many times, she'll say things that were like, wow, thank you for saying that, because she has a different perspective on everything. So we're really lucky to find her.
Laurie, on a community level, I know there's been some pushback, when it comes to who sits on those community foundation boards and on the committees that make those funding decisions. And I think some of that work is still tricky because the people that may be the funders are not the same people that are from the community. Have you seen any examples of stories that they're trying to do a better job with informing, not just here's what we're going to fund, apply for it, but here's what the community needs you to fund?
Yes, it is a huge, there is a big movement in that space to increase the voices in grant making, to do inclusive participatory grant making. But the challenge is, how do you move from ticking off a box, yes, we're going to have a community meeting, to actually engage the community in meaningful ways? And I think that's where everyone's struggling, is getting to meaningful participation.
Because I think so much of this is also wrapped up in trust, right? I mean, these organizations, the funders. So I know when I've been in community meetings, and you've probably been in those too, where I'm trying to ask, nonprofits how they feel about a certain thing, and they all look around and go, is there a funder here?
Funder here?
Is the funder here? Because if the funder's here, you may not exactly get, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, because they're so afraid of losing the funding.
Yeah, and it's not even involving other professionals from nonprofit organizations in those decisions, right? Because they know the community really well, but it's actually getting service beneficiaries and recipients at the table. And that's the hard part, to do that well.
Yeah. How do you engage in your, Brett, working in Kenya? How do you know that this is the route you should be going to be most beneficial for those kids that you're trying to affect change?
No, that's actually a great question. And I should have been thinking about that with your last question. This is part of why we hired our 2 full-time people. Also, we pay 3 people part-time. 2 of them are the couple that have hosted me. They're kind of the leaders in the community. He's a retired teacher. And over the years I've done this, there's many times we disagree. I mean, we have very open discussions and we disagree. And in every disagreement except one, I agree, end up going with what they want, because it's their world, it's their culture. Who the heck am I to tell them, how we should do this? To be frank, the only thing I've ever stood up for is this rule of evenly dividing money between boys and girls. There's a strong segment of the population, even women, who don't think girls should get an education. And that's the one thing I put my foot down. But everything else, I trust their views, their values. It's their world, it's not mine.
No, that's a great example. Great example. So any other questions or thoughts that we haven't touched on, Laurie or Brett, or if others? Oh, Terry, are you turning your camera on because you have a question? Yay, Terry. Go ahead if you do. She's like, no, I just turned it on to say hi. Hang on, I'll unmute you. Let's see here. Where's Terry? There she is. Okay. See if you can unmute yourself.
All right.
There we go.
Can you hear me? Excellent.
Hi, Terry.
Hi there. Thank you so much for your comments.
You should be
today
good. Well, I can't hear you, but you're not muted.
I can hear her.
Alicia, I can hear her.
Okay.
You're unmuted, but I can't hear you still. I'm sorry.
Oh.
We can.
Go ahead, Terry.
Okay.
Your mic is moving, but your voice is not coming out. Is it? Do you have another device hooked up to your computer? Sometimes it's my headset. It'll flip to my other headset, so I can't hear it. You can type it in the chat too.
Hold on a second.
Alicia, we can hear her.
Yeah, we can hear. Yeah, Alicia, let Terry ask the question. Laurie and I can hear her.
There we go.
Okay. Go ahead, Terry.
So sorry about that. I'm from our local community foundation here in DeKalb County, and I'm our community engagement director. And our community foundation is we're at a point where we've been very good at responsive grant making, and we're transitioning to more proactive grant making, or at least trying to get more of an even even scale of responsive and proactive. And so as we're making that transition, I wonder, have you seen or heard of any good tools or um, I guess examples of other community foundations that have indeed done that? And if there are tools that they've used to, whether it's, we want to go out in the community and say, we really want to make an impact here. How can we help you? But maybe invite through an LOI process or something like that, actual true needs that we could then evaluate and discuss for investment. We're just kind of, I think the tool there on how we do it in an equitable way is what we need to build up a little bit.
Oh, sure. I'll quickly respond to that. So have you ever used CF Leads as a resource?
Yes. Yes. I have not asked this question there yet.
Because their peer learning network and some of the work that they've done around participatory grant making is probably, leading the field. But in addition, this is not as a direct an example. I mean, there's a lot of resources on participatory engaged grant making. And so if you actually want to send me an email, I can send some of those to you. But in Indiana, the Lilly Endowment has tried to shift the entire field to community leadership, right, for the entire state. And we've got a lot of lessons coming out of Indiana. So I could also pose your question here to some local grant makers, because I think what you need to also do is learn from local grant makers who have done it.
Yes, and I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel if we don't have to, but we can definitely tweak it and make it our own. So yeah, I just wondered if you had some successful models there.
Yeah, so send me some, so Alicia put my email in there. Send me a message and I'll connect you with some.
Fantastic. Oh, Alicia's already on it.
Yeah, she's quick.
Watching all my screens. Sorry, I was the only one who couldn't hear you when you were talking at the beginning, but everybody else can hear you just fine. I muted myself. Any other questions from our participants today? I know that there's a couple of fundraisers on the line because I know you. And there's a couple of students. So any of our students or our fundraisers that are out there, any questions you want to ask Brett or Laurie?
Yeah, I always love to hear from students. Don't they get bonus points?
I'm trying to see if any of them are in my classes right now.
Laurie, I always gave my students bonus points. I don't know if Alicia does that.
I'm stingy on the extra credit stuff, gotta say. I am stingy. Kate or Lynn, you guys are both working fundraisers. So any questions for Laurie or Brett? It's terrible that I know them by the first name. I can try and call.
Oh, so we've got a question
okay.
in, yeah.
Oh, good.
Okay, Kenyan NGOs from Aiden here. Totally different from nonprofits here. It's an incredibly complex process. I've been talking to a lawyer who is going to try to help me through it. I thought he was going to do it for a reasonable amount of money. Now he's talking a lot of money, but there are 14 steps in the process and a form for every one of those steps and a service fee that has to be paid in every one of those steps. The service fee in Kenya is just a bribe. So to be frank, it has not been my highest priority right now, but to get to where we want to go to, we're going to have to become a Kenyan NGO.
Yeah. Kate sent me a message just kind of asking about the hard questions. What are you hearing out there in the field, either from your own experiences or other examples that you have about COVID with the drop in fundraising ability for many of these nonprofits? How honest and open are organizations being during COVID? And do you have recommendations on how open and transparent should they be if they're struggling? And I always say sometimes this is hard because donors don't want to give to sinking ships, right? It's hard to fundraise for debt. I mean, all of those kinds of things, we talked about that before, but I think COVID it's kind of upending some of our assumptions. So how honest and transparent should these organizations be when they're talking about sustainability to their donors?
I always think transparency is key because it's a relationship based in trust. So I think that's key. I think the challenge, though, that organizations are facing is donor burnout. And just we're all faced with burnout, right? You're hearing too much now. So just being really targeted and honest in your communications, I think is really important. And one thing that I'd like to say in the community foundation space, when we've been looking at fundraising for COVID-19, it's stopped. It's done. I don't know if that's Terry's experience in her community. And so I worry about the next 3 or 4 months, which aren't getting easier. And most of the grant money has gone out the door around COVID-19. So I don't know what the future looks like for nonprofits. And I just think that that's very hard.
So we're over the initial emergency funding, and now we're into something
How
else.
do we get
Yeah.
donors into, I mean, we're still in emergency. We're not even into recovery and the next step of sustainability. So
Right. Goes along with our Zoom fatigue,
yes,
right? How do we keep fundraising in this unknown environment, or how long is it going to last, for sure?
struggling and sinking are very different. Yes, Lynn. Yeah, it's tough.
On the transparency thing, I'm in a different state. We don't have employees in the US. The employees that we have in Kenya, to be frank, we pay them very well by Kenyan standards, but paying them very well by Kenyan standards is a very small amount of money for us. So that's not really an issue for us. But I do strongly believe in transparency, but I'll make one important point. When I made the point about girls and the dangers girls face, I don't say that most of the time. I don't use that in fundraising. I think personally, I don't think it's proper. This, as an educational class here, I thought it was an important point to make, but I'm not that transparent. I don't think that's appropriate.
Yeah. Well, I really want to thank both of you for spending the last hour with us and sharing your expert opinions, Brett. Yeah, all of your experiences really, really help to inform our understanding of philanthropy, particularly outside of the US. And I think some students, they don't get that exposure in class all the time. So it's nice to hear it from someone who's living it on a regular basis. And I appreciate, Laurie, your background and interest, especially your research. So please follow Laurie and her research at Indiana. The Lilly School of Philanthropy is doing so much for our understanding of philanthropy and how that impacts the world. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and I will send out a recording of this as well.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. This was fun. Everybody take care.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.